I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. The second impeachment trial of Donald Trump ended with the Senate acquitting him by a vote of 57 to 43. 7 Republicans voted to convict, well short of the 17 GOP votes needed for conviction, but still the most bipartisan impeachment in history. The outcome of the trial never in doubt. So if conviction was virtually impossible, what was the Democrats' goal? Peter Baker writes in the Times that House managers aimed their arguments, quote, at 2 other audiences beyond the chamber: the American people, whose decision to deny Mr. Trump a second term was put at risk, and the historians who will one day render their own judgments about the former president and his time in power. So, what's the political fallout from the trial, and what's ahead for Republicans and for Donald Trump? Peter Baker joins us. He's the Times chief White House correspondent. And Peter, what did the trial of Donald Trump accomplish? You pointed out that a year ago, the president emerged emboldened from his acquittal. This time it was not so much an exoneration as an escape. But can the president claim vindication again?
Well, that's a great question, Sam. Of course, he doesn't have the venue of the White House that he did a year ago. A year ago, he staged a triumphal celebration in the East Room. He brought his allies in, commanded, the national airways, and taunted his enemies and crowed about his acquittal. This year, he remains secluded in Mar-a-Lago. We haven't seen him since the trial began. We haven't seen him since the trial ended. He put out a couple of written statements, including one trashing Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader who voted for acquittal, but did give a very tough speech blaming the president for what happened. But otherwise, we haven't seen him yet. So we haven't yet figured out exactly what his next step is. He didn't have the same ability, I think, to declare victory this time that he did last time, if for no other reason that he's no longer in the White House because he lost the election.
Jamel Bowie pointed out in the Times that the Republican Civil War is over, in that Trump has won, that the Republican Party still belongs to Trump. What is the backlash going to be against the 7 Republicans who voted to convict, and where does Mitch McConnell stand in this? He wanted to have it, or seemed to want to have it, both ways. He voted to convict, he voted not to convict, but claimed that while the president was guilty in a sense, while he helped foment the riot, there wasn't a constitutional basis to convict. So is there really going to be an attempt by Trump supporters to oust him? How vulnerable is he, and how vulnerable are the other Republicans?
Well, that's a great question. The 7 Republican senators who voted to convict, most of them immediately felt the backlash back home. And in several cases, their state Republican parties voted to censure them or otherwise express their displeasure with them. But it's a long time before them see election again. Only one of those 7, Lisa Murkowski, is up for election in 2022. The rest are either retiring or they're not up for 4 or 6 years. And 4 or 6 years in American politics is a lifetime. We would not have imagined where we are today 6 years ago. So I think the ones who are not up next year can feel fairly comfortable that the environment is not at all set for how they'll face the voters next time. And there'll be other things that'll probably be at the top of the issue plate at the time. Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, a different situation. She's already proven that she can overcome an extraordinary odds. She won her last term as a write-in candidate against both Republican and Democratic nominees. So she has a certain, I think, hold in Alaska that is different than other senators have, and she probably feels pretty comfortable about that. What you see with McConnell, of course, is either somebody who tried to have it both ways, as you point out, or somebody who was acting on principle, as his own allies would say, by being honest about Trump's responsibility, even though he believed that constitutionally you can't put a former president on trial. Either way, of course, it's earned him very few friends on either side. And certainly former President Trump will do what he can to punish Mitch McConnell if he can. We'll see how far his power extends now that he's out of office. This will be the big test.
Peter, if I'm right, Trump still has not conceded, but now can we move on? Are we still haunted by this election? And how long can Joe Biden not talk about Donald Trump?
I don't think Joe Biden wants to talk about Donald Trump. He does want to move on, but he benefits from the fact that the rest of us still talk about Donald Trump. To be honest. Because in fact, while it's sort of a shadow over his presidency, it's also a reminder of what his presidency was all about. And his presidency was about putting Donald Trump out of office. Right now, I think the latest poll I saw from Morning Consult, Politico, showed that President Biden's approval rating is around 62%. In modern time, given how polarized our society is, that's an extraordinarily high number, a number that President Trump never got anywhere near for a single day of his term in office. He never, ever one day exceeded 50% in the mainstream polls. And I think that part of that is because of the reminder of what people were willing to move past. While Republican base voters are still very much for President Trump, the broader public is not. And I think that they're tired of President Trump and that they are rewarding President Biden for the fact that he's not President Trump. If we stop talking about Trump, if Trump does in fact disappear and fade into the woodwork, which doesn't seem likely, that means that President Biden has a different kind of challenge, which is to hold together the fragile coalition that got him into office. Remember, Democrats disagree with each other sometimes, almost as much as they disagree with Republicans. And the one thing that was uniting them last year, not so far this year, has been a mutual antipathy toward Donald Trump.
Is 62% in the polls today enough of a mandate for Joe Biden to actually carry his agenda into reality?
Well, look, he has a very, very slim party control in Congress. Remember, of course, in the Senate, the Democrats split with the Republicans 50-50, and they have the majority only because of the tie-breaking vote of the Vice President, Kamala Harris. In the House, the margin is only slightly better for Democrats, not much better than that. So he has to be very aware of that limited power as he pushes forward his agenda. He doesn't need Republicans necessarily to get anything done, but he has to be able to hold all the Democrats and on the one side to Joe Manchin on the other. That by itself is a negotiation just to get something that all 50 Democrats there would agree with.
And 62% is nice at this point, but what can Joe Biden do, if anything, to reach out to those more than 70 million Americans who voted for Donald Trump?
It's a very good question, because we are at a point where the new president coming in traditionally does try to reach out to people who voted against him or her. And I think that that's something that Joe Biden would like to do. That's his inclination. But it's such a tribal moment in our society, such a tribal moment in our politics, that you don't see a lot of give on the part of either side. Now, 62% does mean that he has the support of a lot of independents and at least some Republicans at the moment. Doesn't mean they'll stick with him, but it does mean that they are, satisfied with him and not offended by him. The Trump wing of the party wants to talk about socialism, but the 62% who are backing Biden don't see a socialist; they see a Democrat who's pushing for a large relief plan for COVID because a lot of Americans are hurting. And so while the president may not get the bipartisan votes he wants in Congress for that relief plan, what the White House is already saying is, look, it's bipartisan anyway, because we have a lot of Republican support among voters, and therefore we'll count that as bipartisan.
Well, we'll see if that works. That stimulus plan is going to obviously affect a lot of people and presumably positively, and that's got to score some political points for the president. Thanks to Peter Baker, the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times. And coming up next, will that Biden COVID relief plan pump up the economy? We'll hear from the Times' Paul Krugman. While the nation has been riveted by the drama of Donald Trump's second impeachment trial, President Biden has been focused on something else, jumpstarting an economy that's been ravaged by COVID. The stock market may be at record highs, but the market isn't the economy. In the real world economy, many businesses, large and small, have been decimated. Millions are unemployed. Hundreds of thousands are faced with food insecurity. Biden wants to go big with a $1.9 trillion stimulus package, a price tag so high it's drawing heat from right and left. Times columnist Paul Krugman writes, quote, "The plan is aggressive enough that some Democratic-leaning economists worry that it will be too big, risking inflation. However, I've argued at length that they're wrong, or more precisely, that, as Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen says, the risks of doing too little outweigh any risk of overheating the economy." Times columnist Paul Krugman, a Nobel Prize winning economist, the author of Arguing with Zombies, which is just out in paperback. Paul, you've written that you've never seen anything quite like this particular economic crisis, that it's not exactly a conventional recession, it's more like a natural disaster. What do you mean by that?
Okay, normally a recession happens because you don't have people aren't spending enough one way or another. There just isn't enough demand. Businesses can't sell. They lay off workers. A normal recession is about a failure to provide enough oomph in the economy. That's not what's happening now. The reason that we are still have so many unemployed, the reason that the economy is still operating below where we expected it to be, before the pandemic, is the pandemic. It is the fact that stuff is not safe. The reason that restaurant employment is way, way down is not because people can't afford to eat in restaurants, it's because they don't dare to eat in restaurants. So this is much more like an economy that's in a, originally I said it was kind of like an induced coma. It's a economy that's depressed because of the virus. In a way, it should be depressed. We don't want to return to normal activity until it's safe, which is probably going to be at this point in the summer. And so the solutions, the things you want to do for it, are not the same as the answer to a conventional recession.
And why does this differ from the Obama stimulus of over a decade
Well, the
ago?
Obama stimulus, that was a conventional recession. It was brought on by an extraordinary unexpected financial crisis. But when you came down to how did that lead to mass unemployment? The answer was, well, consumer spending, business investment, housing investment all collapsed. That's not the issue here. We're not really exactly short of expenditure. What we have is a lot of people, a lot of businesses that are suffering. So what you're trying to do now is not goose the economy. What you're trying to do is get people through until we can resume normal life. And so it's disaster relief. It's not stimulus. It drives me crazy that people keep on calling it stimulus. It's not a stimulus plan. It's an economic relief package designed to get us through this extraordinary trial by virus.
Obviously, we haven't had this package approved yet, but you pointed out that there's a fair amount of bipartisan support for it. Why is that?
Well, it's funny. I think stimulus, the old thing, is hard for people to wrap their minds around. It's back in 2009, the Republican House leader said people are tightening their belts, so the government should tighten its belt too, which was deeply stupid, but actually resonated for people who hadn't economic, kind of made sense. And that was fundamentally a hard sell. This time, well, the idea that people are in trouble because of an event that's outside their control, I think almost everybody gets that. There's none of the, people borrow too much money, so they're in trouble because they were irresponsible. Why should I help them? In this case, it's, my God, people can't work because of the virus. And I think even a majority of Republicans see some point in helping people who are in trouble through no fault of their own.
You've said that, though, is the 1.9 trillion being spent in the optimal fashion? No, it isn't. But that's not actually the right question. So what is the right question?
The right question is, well, first of all, can we afford it? The answer is yes. The federal government can borrow at incredibly low interest rates. Debt is not a problem at this cost of money. And the second question is this going to do we need to be spending something like this amount in order to get the bulk of the people who really need help? So there's some things that are targeted, unemployment benefits, clearly. There should be no question about that. The unemployed need help. Spending on the pandemic, getting shots in arms, obviously, that's a no-brainer. There's a bunch of stuff in the package that's a little bit more diffuse, that will throw money a little bit more broadly in ways that will reach some people who are probably not in trouble. So those $1,400 checks, some people really need them because they're falling through the cracks of the other measures. Not lots of people don't need them, but that's okay. It's okay to, given the severity of the crisis, it's much more important to make sure that help is reaching those who need it than to worry that some help is reaching people who don't need it. And that's kind of where we are right now.
And why don't we have to worry about inflation?
Well, I mean, let me say, this is not the inflation issue is not a completely stupid thing to worry about. This is we're throwing out a lot of money. The economy, there's slack in the economy, so we can afford to do this up to a point. It may be that we're going to boost things beyond that point, but there are multiple reasons not to get too worked up about it. First of all, there is still, when all is said and done, substantial slack in the economy. We're not going to overheat that easily. Goldman Sachs just put out a report saying that there's way more slack than people think, and so don't worry about that too much. The second is that to the extent that we're giving money to people who don't need it, they're also probably not going to spend very much of it. So the diffuseness of this thing leads to a big high headline number, but probably not, in a way, there's not that much stimulus in this package relative to the size, to the headline number. And that's a good thing. It means that not to worry too much. And the last is we have this thing called the Federal Reserve. If inflation should start to up a little bit, the Fed is easily able to choke that off with tighter monetary policy. So it's really, really hard to, everybody who's on this is saying, oh, it's going to be the 1970s all over again. Well, it took years and years of irresponsible policy to get stagflation, and that's not going to happen this time.
So if the president came to you and said, Paul, okay, am I doing the right thing? What would you say?
Oh, yeah. I mean, because we learned a lesson, even though this is a very different crisis from 2009, we learned an important lesson then, which was that if you come in with a halfway measure and it turns out to be inadequate, you probably don't get another chance. You really want to go big now. And if it turns out that some of the money, it turns out that state governments use a fair bit of the money to bulk up their rainy day funds instead of to hire lots of workers, that's okay. If middle class people end up putting those checks in their bank accounts, that's okay. What would not be okay would be to fall short, come back and say we need more, and have Congress unwilling to pass the legislation, which is what happened last time. So much better to go with pretty much everything you think you might need. And if there's some excess, that there's some air in the package, that's okay.
Paul Krugman of the New York Times, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll be back with the state of the city. We're almost a full year into New York's COVID lockdown, and the city's economy is still staggering. Tourism, a huge part of that economy, is almost non-existent. Broadway and movie theaters closed. Governor Cuomo just okayed a limited indoor dining at restaurants, although at just 25% capacity. Retail and real estate reeling. Midtown, a ghost town with the vast majority of office workers doing their jobs from home. The Times reports, quote, the city's property tax revenues are projected to decline by $2.5 billion next year, the largest such drop in at least 3 decades. That's because of a plunge in the value of office building and hotel properties. How long is the economic fallout from the pandemic expected to last? And are we even starting to get on the road to recovery? We're joined by David Goodman and Matthew Haag, both Metro reporters for the New York Times. There have been predictions for normalcy, possibly by 2024. Matthew, are those predictions realistic? And these days, how are we defining normalcy?
Sam, those are very good questions. I think if anybody looked back and said we would still be in this situation nearly a year later, nobody would believe us. So I think it's truly difficult to predict whether 2024 is too far away, which it sounds just far away just thinking about it, or whether it's realistic. President Biden has said that vaccines and normalcy might be available by Christmas this year. So it seems like maybe 2022 could be a year for recovery. But you just look at all the metrics and it's just, there's hard to find reason for optimism. Office buildings are about 14% full. Nobody's really buying real estate. Companies are wrestling with whether they're going to return to the office at all. Companies like Salesforce and Spotify both have huge offices in New York City saying they're converting to a work from home permanently. It just seems like there's a paradigm shift in the way that we work and live that will dictate how New York City recovers and whether tourists, 50, 60 million of them every year, whether they're comfortable coming back and what sort of environment that would have to look like, where they would want to spend money and stay here for a week and help revive this economy.
David, we just heard from Paul Krugman of the Times talking about the impact of the stimulus bill, stimulus that he calls more disaster relief than stimulus. What impact is that going to have on New York City? How helpful is that going to be in terms of helping the city budget deficit and helping the city recover in general?
It's a big relief. I mean, it's what both the governor and the mayor were counting on, was having a change in administration and a federal government that was willing to support states and local governments. And the mayor really crafted his budget around the idea that he could avoid layoffs only if he got more money from the feds. And so, I don't think at this point it's enough to get us where we need to be, but I think there's optimism that this is an administration that's going to work with cities and not try to undercut them or punish them in ways that we saw in the previous administration. So there's optimism on that front. At the same time, the city is still facing, historic budget deficits and not in a position next year that's going to be any better, or this current fiscal year that's any better than the previous one, and in fact, much worse. And as we look to 2022, there's sort of compounding problems here in the budget that are going to take time to get over.
And Matthew, is there any silver lining in that legislation? Any real hope for Broadway, for the entertainment industry, for the tourist industry, for retail chains or mom and pop retail stores that may benefit from this legislation that maybe will get them back to at least where they were, or even conceivably better than they were before?
Well, they're certainly hopeful, and I think they're hoping that it's more than just a stopgap, because who knows how long that might last. What would it take for people to be comfortable to stay in a Broadway theater, and how many people could it fit, and whether that's sustainable? There's just so many questions. Restaurants, you mentioned at the top about coming back to 25% indoor capacity. That's still not enough. Even back last summer, they were saying they need 50%. I was been talking to people this week who work in the restaurant industry, and with the snow that we've had recently, haven't had outdoor dining. It's more than just the aid that's available. Is there something on the other end? Can the city support this many restaurants? Do this need this many office buildings? There's these huge, just overarching questions about to the core of Manhattan especially, but New York City broader, that need to be wrestled with. And there's not many easy answers.
I think, though, just on the optimistic side, I mean, I think that there's, and you feel it in the city, that there's this pent-up demand for things that we, grew accustomed to, for restaurants, for entertainment. And I think one of the things that we see in this, federal stimulus bill, and just in the federal government's approach in general, is a commitment to trying to get the vaccines rolled out more quickly and improve that whole system. And that's really what it comes down to, is people feeling safe doing activities again. And I think that is going to take more people getting vaccinated. But even in my neighborhood in Jackson Heights, I mean, even at 25% capacity, you have all these like outdoor sheds for restaurants that are filling, and we're filling before the expansion over the Valentine's Day weekend. And so just people want to get out and want to get taking advantage of the city that they love again. And I think they're still feeling held back because the pandemic is not under control. But really, it's been true all along. If we get the public health side controlled, the economies will sort of follow suit.
Matthew, what about things like office buildings, though? Will people ever return in the numbers that they were working before the pandemic? And if not, what happens to that space?
Well, that's a good question, Sam. I think that there will be a return to offices. Salesforce, as I mentioned, saying that you can work from home permanently if you want, but they're also recommending if employees do want to come back in, it's 1 to 3 days a week. I think that sort of approach will be adopted by a lot of companies. There are some benefits to working remotely in New York City as well. You don't have to commute for an hour or two each way, and you can start to work early and work later. But there are just great benefits to being around people and the spontaneity and this sort of creative thinking of talking to colleagues. I think there'll be a desire to return. What that looks like, whether they need as much space. I think companies will downsize. They don't need entire floors anymore. I think there'll be a lot of movement. And as someone pointed out the other day, Midtown has the oldest buildings on average in the country. So will people want to move to newer buildings like Hudson Yards or One Vanderbilt? Will there be desire to have newer space that's has room for workers not to be so crammed together? I think there'll be a lot of changes in the coming months and years.
And David, obviously there have been a lot of assessments of how Governor Cuomo, how Mayor de Blasio have reacted to the COVID pandemic. But what have we seen from the candidates running for mayor? Have we seen very quickly, have we seen any bold new solutions to the city's economy?
Not as of yet. No, I mean, I don't think, it's not an area of strength for this field of having, creative solutions that haven't been tried before. I mean, I think everyone wants, the vaccine rollout to go better. And, there's ideas for trying to stimulate local economies and have reinvestment in the city that's more localized and to neighborhoods. But I haven't seen a grand plan for Manhattan from anyone that seemed new.
That's reassuring, isn't it, though? Thanks to David Goodman, Matthew Haag of the New York Times, and for the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.